The following fanfiction contains scenes of body horror. Though it is not a torture porn, viewer or listener discretion is advised. Also,
I sound nothing like Wally Franks. The only reason I went ahead with the voiceover other than the poll is because it had some funky pronunciation going on. Also, please forgive the constant ticking. There's about 20 clocks around my head.
Published on October 25, 2018, here is Don't Drink the Ink. That was pretty much the slogan of Joey Studios. Whether or not the ink was toxic, it surely smelled like it. This was recited amongst the staff because of accidental consumption. It would seem like a silly thing to accidentally ingest something pitch black, but the thing was that the ink started to leak everywhere. You would leave out a mug of coffee and return an hour later to find it half filled with ink. It got into the staff room, it got into the water supply. Don't drink the ink, even a drop, and you were good to go. Wally was baffled at how this was a rule at all. He spent the most time tending to the machine, soaked in ink, and yet he hadn't even come close to drinking the ink. It smeared on his face, but it didn't get in his mouth. He made sure of that. It had to be a complete idiot who accidentally chugged down a mug of coffee only to realize that the dark fluid was ink instead of coffee. As for willingly drinking the ink, nobody was stupid enough to do that. Maybe Sammy, maybe on a bad day, but normally nobody would be chugging down ink when there was metallic water from the taps. But that was before everything happened, back when people could leave the studio, when inhuman things didn't walk the halls, and everyone wasn't either missing or dead. The water pipes had run out on this floor days ago and were replaced with thick clumps of coagulated ink. The temptation for water on the other floors wasn't enough to drag Wally out of his office. Not when those things still roamed the hallways. Ever since he locked himself in here, he had managed to be safe. A file cabinet now blocked the locked door and the room was stacked in cans upon cans of bacon soup. The stuff was all over the place and Wally had just assumed that it would quench his thirst and curb his hunger at the same time. Alas, bacon was salty, and the soup was like brine. Not to mention how much he hated that cheeky picture of Bendy beaming at him from the cans. Once he got out of here, he could go a lifetime without ever seeing Bendy's face again. It only took a few days before Wally was starting to feel rough, and he knew it was because he was thirsty. The soup was only making it worse and his options were running out. Eventually he started to get double vision that the soup just wasn't helping. He considered going out to hunt water, but then again, it was soon decided that it was simply not a good option.
Look, I'm gonna have to drink something,
Wally rationalized, talking out loud to himself to alleviate the constant boredom and solitude of being locked in this room.
My skin's getting all dry, feels like I've been sucking on gravel, and the soup's pretty much disgusting. But it was like that before it became breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
As casual as Wally would sound to any audience listening in, he was becoming concerned. Not to mention that the lack of fluids was starting to hurt. The craving was always there. It was then that he just happened to notice the ink leaking through the roof of his office. The same ink that made up those monsters that blocked him from freedom, save that it looked much thinner than the thick gunk that clogged the water pipes. Even it, as chemical-filled as it was, looked quenching. Like dirted rainwater dripping through the cracks and offering salvation.
What would be in that stuff anyways? Just water and dye, right?
Wally asked as he looked at the dripping fluid.
Might not smell too good, but what's the worst that can happen? I die? At this point I'm gonna die from a lack of water a lot quicker than ink poisoning.
He leaned over and placed an empty soup can under the dripping fluid.
Looks pretty much just like the bacon soup anyway, right? Can't taste any worse.
There was a part of Wally that knew this was a terrible idea. There was also a part of him that was very afraid of death, whether through dehydration or poisoning. All he knew was that it was becoming excruciating waiting here for nothing. His mouth and throat were dry, his hands constantly shook, and he needed something to sate himself. With a defeated huff, he reached out and snatched up the soup can. Ink spilled over his fingers, it was slightly warm, and he groaned in disgust, but he was still just desperate, and he moved it closer. It didn't smell right. He tilted it back slowly and let the ink slide down towards his lips. Then it touched them and out of reflex he sucked in, filling his mouth with ink. The taste of some sort of foul meat struck him and he promptly turned over and spat the fluid onto the floor. He coughed and heaved, trying to get the taste and grime from his mouth.
Forget it, it ain't worth it.
That should have been the final word on it. Unfortunately, it wasn't. Within hours, the temptation was coming back again. In his thirsty, deluded state he started to wonder if it was as bad as he had thought. It was pretty much just like the bacon soup, right? The only difference was that it was less salty, ignoring the chemical components entirely. It wasn't like it was the ink that made people into those things outside the door, because he had been in contact with more ink than anyone else and nothing had changed. Wally was systematically convincing himself to go ahead with trying it again. Eventually, those thoughts led back to the can of ink. The ink had only cooled now but hadn't thickened or anything odd. It seemed to smell less toxic as well, or perhaps that was his mind playing tricks on him. Wally still cringed as he stared into the blackness. With a slow exhale, he swallowed the last of his worries, and tilted his head back to let the ink in again. It was just as foul as before, but this time he silently decided to let it in. He drank down some of the ink and then slammed the can down on the desk.
And now I die.
Wally choked out through the grime of the ink. It was thick in his throat as he stared down at the desk. It would have sounded deceptively like a joke, but wide-eyed Wally, looking like a frightened animal, knew that it was very possible that he was now poisoned. Yet he stuck with his decision. He couldn't sink any lower, stuck in the bottom of Joey Drew's studio dying of dehydration and overdosing on bacon soup. Maybe it would kill him quicker, or maybe it would at least alleviate the nagging thirst. He could only wait and see. So, he did. He waited, and time ticked by. An hour, 2, and then the thirst again reached frustrating levels. Though by now he would have assumed that his body would have reacted to the ink. Throwing caution to the wind, he drank more, and again nothing happened. Time was moving as slow as usual, but Wally felt largely fine with all of it. He didn't feel poisoned, he didn't even feel that thirsty anymore. He just felt as uncomfortable as one would in this situation. Wally continued to drink the ink. By that evening, which he only knew it was evening because the Bendy clock on the wall claimed it was 7 o'clock, Wally had started collecting can after can of the dripping ink. By now he had learned that it wasn't good to drink it straight from the drippings. Letting it settle and cool helped the meaty, chemical flavor settle down. It also caused any sediments to sink and cooled the temperature into a more pleasing one. It wasn't a fresh bottle of pop, but it was, arguably, better than having nothing at all. The first time something turned out to be amiss was around then. Wally had been trying and failing to force a can of soup down. Needless to say, Wally no longer had a taste for the soup, and settled on drinking more of the ink. He scowled at a thick mixture of saliva and ink that had settled on the back of his tongue. It was then that he somehow managed to notice the thick mixture now settled on his teeth and reached to rub at it.
When I get out of here, my teeth are going to be trashed. Nobody's going to want to kiss a guy walking around with a mouthful of river rocks.
Wally said to nobody but himself. Though that was when he noticed something, like the smallest piece of loose flesh, and pulled his hand back. Instead of it being his mouth, the flesh has peeled from the tip of his finger, which had a pruned consistency to it. In fact, all his fingertips were wrinkled now that he looked at them.
Oh, that can't be good. Huh. Irony. Here I am with no water and I'm all pruned up.
A little more of the skin peeled, but what was underneath was still normal skin and it didn't hurt, so he wrote it off as nothing. It was fine. Or it was fine, until the itch started to settle in. The itch was hands down one of the worst feelings he had ever felt because of its agonizing locations. On the tips of his fingers, in the folds of his palms, spreading along his wrists, it all seemed so hard to scratch just right. Worse still, the skin continued peeling, leaving flakes underneath his nails. At some point it settled in his lower legs, but he couldn't reach them under his pants and boots, and thus kept his aggressive assault to his arms.
Yeah, my luck. I get allergic to this stuff only now that I need it for something. Damn it!
He snatched up the lid of a can and lightly scratched it over the skin of his inner arm. More of the soft skin started to peel away, but still the itch continued.
That's it. I'm calling today a loss.
He figuratively tossed up his hands and headed to his bed. He didn't know how he intended on sleeping through this, but he wouldn't stand another minute awake with it. He shut off the office lights and moved to the corner where he slept. Naturally, there wasn't a bed or cot accessible down in the studio or not on the floors around him, so he was stuck with a tarp and some rolled-up jackets. He had come accustomed to it over the last while and, even though still uncomfortable, it was better than trying to sleep in the office chair with his feet on the desk. He found the tarp easily in the dark due to the smallness of the room and laid down. He tossed the can lid away somewhere, folded his arms underneath his head, and tried to ignore the tingling irritation chewing at him.
No more ink. I'll go find water tomorrow. Not another drop of that stuff.
He then forced his eyes closed and tried to think of anything else. Not of ink, not of water, but maybe soup, bacon soup, those old Bendy commercials for bacon soup that used to air around the holidays. Scene opens in Bendy's kitchen. Snow is falling outside the window as Bendy walks towards the stove. Zoom in on stove and pot. Bendy lifts Breyer label bacon soup can. The image holds on the can for 3 seconds. Camera draws back as Bendy opens the can with opener and dumps it into the pot. He turns on the stove and the soup begins to boil. He stirs it clockwise 3 times. There is a knocking at the door. Bendy hurries over and opens the door. Various characters Boris, Butcher Gang, Lucius Lamb charge past Bendy and storm for the pot where they start stealing the soup. Camera pulls in as the other characters leave. Bendy finally makes it to the pot to see it empty. He begins to cry. There's a knocking at the door. The scene changes to show the door, where Santa is standing in the snow. Cuts to outside the house. Bendy runs out into the snow smiling and Santa pulls out nice and naughty list and shows it to Bendy. Bendy scratches chin thoughtfully. Santa hums and snaps his fingers, then rushes inside to the pot. Bendy follows in and Santa pulls a can of bacon soup out of his pocket. Bendy scratches his neck as he watches. Santa dumps the soup into the pot and starts to stir as it boils. Bendy scratches his arms. Bendy scratches harder. Scratches harder. Scratch, scratch, scratch.
Ah!
With a frustrated cry, Wally roused out of a dead sleep to find himself scraping at his arm again. The itch had slightly diminished where he was scratching and was replaced with a strange, tingling feeling.
For the love of...
He sat upwards in the darkness and drew his hand away to rub at his face. It was only then that he noticed something sticky and half-dried on his hand. He paused long enough to take in the smell, chemicals and metal. It was definitely ink.
For crying out loud!
He stood and felt for the light.
I swear if another leak sprung up, I'm grabbing all my stuff, monsters be damned, and I'm...
Wally flipped on the light, looked down, and stared at a hand stained red.
Bleeding.
Looking down at his arm, even through groggy eyes, he realized that his incessant scratching had left deep cuts and peeled skin, both of which were now drawing fresh and drying blood.
Bleeding everywhere?
This wasn't good. He couldn't afford to have open wounds when he didn't have any bandages or medicine of any kind. It could become infected, it could get poisoned, it could attract something from outside. He had to get it covered quickly. Swearing and sweating in panic as he did so, he picked through the cleanest of the cloth and found a mostly ink-free jacket. Taking out his penknife, he cut off one of the arms and shredded it into thinner pieces to use as a bandage. He then wrapped and tied them over the gashes on his arm, not even capable of washing off the blood due to the lack of water.
No more scratching.
There wasn't even a shred of humor, just a cringe and a shudder at the sight of the blood. He would probably need more fluids to make up for it. Maybe he would be forced to return to the ink. Though not yet, he wasn't that desperate yet. He collapsed into the chair with a low groan and instantly noticed a soreness beginning to spread through his lower legs.
And more damage check. What, was I kicking in my sleep too?
He rubbed at his leg through his pants and felt an ache underneath. Curiosity won out and he leaned over to lift his pants leg. Thankfully there wasn't any blood or scratches, but something else weighted on his skin. There were about 4 bruises starting to form on his leg. They were a reddish purple, about the size of a tennis ball or smaller, and were just as sore as could be. There wasn't an obvious pattern to them, it didn't even seem like the marks lined up to where he would have kicked something. Rolling up the other pants leg revealed more bruises and he pushed them back down and rubbed at his face tiredly. Wally did not return to sleep. After such a disturbing wake-up call, he didn't find it wise to do so. Instead, he tried to stay awake and alert, but soon found weariness gripping him. No, not weariness, but weakness. He supposed it was because he hadn't eaten enough and cracked open another can of bacon soup. Only a bite or two in and he found himself unable to continue. If anything, it just reminded him of how thirsty he was, but his unwillingness to drink any more of the ink stayed strong. He instead pushed the can aside and rested his head on the desk. He was unsure if he fell asleep or what happened, but eventually he came back to consciousness with a can opener painfully poking into his arm and something lower down amiss. He drug himself upright and rubbed over his face tiredly, and slowly realized that it was his leg that felt odd. He reached down and tugged at his pants, only for them to now be stuck to his skin.
Oh gee, I wonder.
He coughed to clear his throat of thick, inky-tinged fluid. He tiredly leaned back in the chair and propped his leg up on the desk.
Let's see. No obvious blood on the hands.
Wally remarked as he mockingly checked his fingernails.
Except the stuff's already been there. Where'd that can lid go? I could have used that.
He exhaled and drug up his pants leg and looked at the damage. And stared. And his eyes widened as his mouth went slack. Because one of the bruises doubled in size, split open, and was now leaking a dark mixture down his leg. If it was blood, then it was too dark, so dark that it almost muted the natural red. He swabbed the fluid with his fingers and raised it to his face to study it. Then to smell it. Then he realized.
Oh my God. It's ink.
He then fell into a coughing spell, hunching over and choking.
God's sakes, it's ink! How'd the ink even... Oh.
It was only now that his tired mind clicked it all together. He drank the ink and now these bruises appeared, and now they were leaking ink. Though. Were they bruises? Tentatively, he palpitated the bruised skin around the leaking wound. The flesh was especially soft, like a bruised piece of fruit, and as he poked it the blend of blood and ink started to drip out faster. They weren't normal bruises at all, they were pockets of ink.
Well, I'm dead.
He said it so bluntly that it startled even him.
There ain't no coming back from this.
He collapsed back into the chair and stared at the roof. He wondered if this was the first stage of turning into whatever those things were roaming the halls. If the ink would spread until he fully became one of the ink monsters.
There's no way in hell that I'm gonna sit here and just let this happen. I put the ink in. I've got to get it out. Alright, here's the 411, folks. So I had this brilliant idea that I would use a voice modulator to make my voice deeper so that I could sound anything like Wally Franks. But what ended up happening was I downloaded something, whatever it was, I think it was like Voice Mod, and it killed my mic. My mic was absolutely gone. My computer could not detect it. It didn't matter if I restarted it or whatever, it wouldn't come up. So I deleted it, and then my mic was fixed. Well, and after about 20 minutes of trying to get my mic to fix in with Audacity, again, it was fixed. So the next plan was an online source that was supposed to change voices. It did not work. Yes, it made my voice a little deeper, but it was like pretty obvious that I was using a fake voice. Like, bad. So in the end, I just went ahead with this. And because I went ahead with this, it sounds funky. It's the sharp, stoic, halting AI against my extremely high-pitched voice kind of comes off as a little bit jarring. The plan is this. You listen to this and tell me what you think. And what I'll do is I'll change the next part accordingly because I haven't started on that yet. So it can either be robot voice, it can be my voice, or it can be a mixture of both. And I am capable of doing any three. I just need to know what you want. And if you made it to the end, thanks for watching. It goes downhill from here.